we are going to talk about the living world, right? When I say living world, living, what do you mean by living? How do you define that living from non-living? This is non-living and I am living. So, how do I know I am living? So, this is what we are going to look in today, because what we have understood over a period of time is this, you can actually define living in various ways. For example, philosophically it can be defined as life, living means living with a purpose. So, there is a purpose for everybody to be on the earth. So, that is philosophical way of definition, but definitely being a scientist, right. So, studying science, we should try and define life in terms of scientific ways, right. So, scientifically, if you look at what makes an organism living and how is it different from a non-living thing. So, that is what we are going to look into today. There are certain characteristics which are very common among all the living beings. So, whether it is a plant, whether it is an animal, whether it is a bacteria, so or fungi. So, all of them the living organisms have certain unifying characters. So, what are those common characteristics of living? So, we will discuss them a little bit in detail, right. So, the first characteristic, let me take it as growth. So, that all the living organisms grow, that is a common feature, right, whether it is a plant, animal, fungi, they all grow. So, how do you define growth? So, growth can be defined in various ways, it is basically, it is an irreversible increase in the mass, right, that is what growth is defined as, irreversible increase in mass, right. So, but growth happens in two ways, animals or plants, they grow in two ways. How do they grow? They grow either by cell division and cell expansion. So, both result in growth, right. So, cell expansion and cell division. Whether if you look at unicellular animals, right, unicellular organisms, for example, let me take an example of amoeba. So, amoeba, how does it grow? There is no growth as such. So, amoeba just grow, for amoeba, growth means what? Reproduction, because amoeba grows by cell division, then it becomes two, right. It undergoes binary fission and then it becomes two amoebae. So, which means in amoeba, in unicellular organisms like amoeba or paramecium or euglena, so growth means reproduction only, right. So, but then if you look at multicellular organisms like for example plants and animals, that is where we need to understand how the growth happens, right. So, if you look at multicellular animals, let us look at certain multicellular organisms, right. So, the growth happens mainly by cell division and also by cell expansion. So, what happens in plants and animals? Is there a difference in the way the growth happens? Definitely yes. If you look at plants, the growth happens continuously. That is why the plants show something known as indefinite growth, which means throughout their life they keep growing, but then the growth is not uniform. It is not that every part of the plant will keep dividing to result in growth. So, there is a different way in how the growth happens in plants. For example, the plants, what happens is at the tip of the plants, right, there is something called meristematic tissue. I am sure you would have heard about it. They are called apical meristems. So, it is nothing but it is a group of dividing cells, actively dividing cells. So, these apical meristems which are there are two types of apical meristems actually. One is called root apical meristem and then there is a shoot apical meristem, and certain times you will also find another one called intercalary meristem, right, which is also found in between the nodes. So, in a plant, so you have at the tips a cluster of meristematic tissues which keep growing, which keep dividing and resulting in the growth of the plant. So, the plants grow at the tips, not in the middle, right, they grow only at the tips. So, they keep on growing throughout the life of the plant, the growth happens. Is it the same in animals? Definitely not. Animals show a different type of growth, right? So, for example, in plants the growth is also called open growth, indefinite growth, right? All these things point out to the plants because they keep growing indefinitely throughout their life. So, let us look at animals. So, if you look at animals, the growth is different because growth is definite. When I say definite, what I mean is they grow only for, you all know, right? We grow maybe up to 14-15 years, after which the growth stops, right? So, we do not increase in height anymore, right? The same thing happens in all the animals where the growth is limited. The animals grow to a certain point in their life, after which the growth stops. But then whether the cell division stops? No, because the cell division keeps happening in those organs, say for example, you take intestine, every day the cells need to be replaced with new cells. So, that time cell division is a must. So, to replace the lost cells, right, the cell division keep happening in different organs, but otherwise it will not result in the growth of the organism as such. So, that is how animals grow. So, there is a difference in the way plants grow and animals grow. But then can we use this, or can we say that growth is the only defining feature of the organism? Whether it is only found in living, it is not found in non-living. Can we say that? If you simply say growth, definitely it is not a defining feature of living organisms, right? You might be wondering, do you mean that non-living things grow? Definitely yes. If you look at mountains, boulders, what happens? They actually grow. So, if you define growth in terms of increase in the mass, definitely the growth happens in mountains and boulders. You agree with me? Then how is it different from living things? So, you need to understand one important point is this: in non-living things, the growth happens only externally, which means, when the mountain grows, things get added to it and then it grows, right? So, but whereas in living organisms, the growth is always internal, it starts from inside. So, there are two different ways the growth happens. It is an internal growth, right, in living organisms, whereas these non-living things show only external growth. So, when you have to say growth, you need to define different conditions in growth happens in living organisms. So, that way you need to explain when you say growth. If you say growth as a definitive feature of living organisms, definitely it is not, right. So, that is one of the features or characteristics of living organisms, right. But then if you look at another characters, let us look at, say for example, reproduction. So, you all know, right, reproduction happens, reproduction is what? Reproduction is producing offsprings which are or progeny which are more or less similar to the parents. So, that is what is reproduction. But then reproduction, you all know that it happens in two ways which you would have studied before, which is called asexual, which is generally shown by lower organisms, but if you look at higher organisms, the reproduction happens sexually, right. So, what is the difference? You all know asexual reproduction involves only one parent, whereas sexual reproduction involves two parents, right. And then in asexual reproduction, the progeny produced will look exactly similar to the parent, right. You can call it as a clone because they are produced from only one parent. So, all the characteristic of that parent will be transferred to the progeny. So, they are called as clones, they are exactly similar. But if you look at sexual reproduction, since two parents are involved, definitely there will be certain recombination happens, because of which new combination of characters might appear in the offspring, right. And apart from that, how does asexual reproduction happens? So, let us look at the ways asexual reproduction happens. So, asexual reproduction happens in many ways. For example, there is one way asexual reproduction happens is if you look at fungi. right? They commonly reproduce asexually using spores which are known as conidia. So, a group of spores which are produced which will give rise to a new fungus or new hyphae of fungus. So, for example, if you take amoeba, so how does the asexual reproduction happens? It happens by binary fission. You take amoeba, paramecium, euglena, those kind of plasmodium, they all undergo fission, right? Then the third one it can happen is, for example, you take hydra or say yeast, which is a unicellular fungus. So, how do they reproduce asexually? They reproduce by budding. They produce small buds, and then those buds will get detached and they can grow into a new organism. You take, for example, animals like, for example, so for example, if you look at flatworms, right, they also reproduce asexually. They show a wonderful property of regeneration. If you cut them into 4 pieces, each piece can grow into a new organism. So, they show this property of regeneration. So, these are various ways by which asexual reproduction happens. So, now whether we can call reproduction as the exclusive property of all living organisms, whether all living organisms reproduce, can we call it as a definitive feature of a living organism? Then there is a question here, because if you actually think of animals, not all animals reproduce. Agree with me? There is something called mule. Have you heard about mule? It is a cross between a donkey and a horse. It is called as mule. It is used to carry a lot of luggage by the people, because it is highly used. So, this animal mule, right, it is sterile. It is produced from a donkey and also horse. So, it is a combination of both. It is sterile, it cannot reproduce. So, can you call it as non-living just because it is not able to reproduce? No, you cannot. Say for example, sterile workers, the worker bees. So, if you look at the worker bees, they never reproduce. They are sterile, they are meant only to do work. Who reproduces in honeybee colony is only the queen along with the male, that alone will reproduce. Rest of the workers are sterile. So, can we call them as non-living? Definitely not. In human beings, there are many couples who are not able to produce children. So, they are also living. So, which means reproduction definitely cannot be called as the most definitive features of all living organisms. So, we need to explain with the exceptions, right. So, this is the second property, the reproduction. Then what is the other property of living organisms? Let us look at one more characteristic, which is metabolism. So, what is metabolism? Metabolism is the cells, the living organisms are made up of lots of molecules. Some of them are big, some, like for example, we have carbohydrates, proteins, nucleic acids, fats. Some of them are small molecules like water, minerals. So, all of them are required. So, what happens in the organism, in a living organisms, these chemicals, these molecules keep changing from one form to another depending upon the need of the organisms. So, the metabolism is nothing but a set of chemical reactions that keep happening inside a living cell. They are known as metabolic reactions. So, the set of chemical reactions which happen inside a living cell is metabolic reaction. So, metabolism is actually classified into two. One is called anabolism and one is called catabolism. So, anabolism is again from the simple molecules, complex molecules are continuously forming. Say for example, when you eat lot of sugar, so what is happening? So, the glucose is getting converted in our body into glycogen. So, glucose is a simple molecule and it is getting converted into glycogen, which is nothing but anabolic reaction, right. Say for example, a lot of amino acids, they are getting converted to proteins by ribosomes in our cells, which is again when I say AA, what I mean is amino acids, right. They get converted to proteins inside the cell, which is nothing but anabolic reactions. So, but then catabolic reactions. So, what are catabolic reactions? Catabolic reactions are just the opposite, where the complex molecules or the larger molecules are converted into simple molecules, which keep happening in our body every single time. So, it is a balance between anabolism and catabolism. So, what is happening? For example, you take respiration. So, what happens? Whenever a cell respires, the glucose is getting converted into CO2 and H2O, right. So, and then releases energy. So, there is one common factor between anabolism and catabolism, that is ATP, energy. Okay. So, anabolic reactions generally take in energy and catabolic reactions generally release energy, right. So, let me explain to you how it happens with the help of an example. Say, let us take, you all know, let us take plants now. You all know that plants photosynthesize, which means what do? They convert CO2 and H2O into carbohydrates, right. So, let me put it this way, carbohydrates. For example, starch, which gets converted into say this one, right. It requires energy, light, you all know it, right. It requires light, it requires chlorophyll, pigments are required, all those things are required, but I am focusing on the energy part. The light energy is needed to convert carbon dioxide and water to form carbohydrate. So, what type of reaction is this? This is definitely anabolic reaction. So, then what happens? So, the energy, the light energy is here converted into chemical energy in the form of starch. So, during respiration what happens? The starch is converted to glucose and then glucose will be catabolized into CO2 and water. And then what does it do? It releases energy in the form of ATP, right. So, what is happening here? So, this is anabolism and this is catabolism. Here energy is used, here energy is released. So, this is photosynthesis, building up reaction, and this is I could say it is hydrolysis, right. So, actually it is a release of energy, which is nothing but respiration. So, this is the way anabolic reactions and catabolic reactions are linked together in our cells, right. So, many of such reactions keep happening. I just gave you an example of photosynthesis and respiration, right. So, metabolism, can we define it as a defining feature of all the living organisms? Do you find metabolic reactions happening inside non-living things? Definitely not, right. So, metabolic reactions never happen in non-living things. Actually, you can do, you know what you can do? You can create these reactions, you can make these reactions happen outside artificially in a test tube, right. So, you take a test tube and you can do all those reactions can be created outside, which is known as in vitro cell free systems. In vitro means cell free, or when you do reactions outside the living organisms, you call it as in vitro. If it is happening inside the body, then it is called in vivo. I am sure you would have heard about these two words, in vivo and in vitro. So, when I say in vitro, it is outside the body. So, definitely we can do these metabolic reactions outside the body in a test tube, it can be done, but you cannot call it as, just because it is happening, it is not a living thing, right. It is happening in a test tube, it does not make it living. So, which means metabolism can be used as a definitive feature of all the living organisms. It cannot happen in non-living things at any point of time, right. So, this is one of the defining features. So, what else are the defining features of all the living organisms? Say for example, I am sure you all know, right, response to the stimuli, we call it as responsiveness. Whether all organisms respond to stimuli? Definitely yes, right. What is meant by response to the stimulus, right? So, the stimulus is something which creates responsiveness. For example, there are three types of stimulus we come across every day: physical stimulus, chemical stimulus and biological stimulus, right. So, when I say physical stimulus, like for example light, so whether plants respond to light? Definitely yes. Whether animals respond to light? Definitely yes. So, which means that is one example of responding to the stimulus. Whether we all respond to touch? Yes. Similarly, whether plants respond to touch? Surely yes, right. I am sure you would have heard about, you know, a plant called as Mimosa pudica. It is actually called touch me not plant. So, you go and touch that, what happens? It immediately responds by you know, closing its leaves, right. So, definitely all the organisms respond to the external stimuli. Have you ever had this experience? You go, you touch a hot stove and what you do? Immediately you take your hand away and run and say ouch, right. So, that is actually responding to the stimulus, right. Similarly, plants, you know, many of these plants, they are actually called seasonal breeders, which means, you know, only in particular season they reproduce, they produce flowers, you all know it. So, how do they know that this is the season? Because they can respond to something known as photoperiod. The duration of light, they can actually measure the duration of the light and respond to it by flowering. So, that is a beautiful example of you know, how they respond to the stimuli. So, all the organisms, whether plants or animals, they are all aware of the surroundings, what is happening around the environment, they are always aware, right. We are aware because of so many senses we have. For example, animals, we all have sense organs which help us to sense the changes in the environment and respond to it, right. So, this is one of the defining feature, that is awareness about the surroundings is a definitive feature of all the living organisms. In fact, human beings are self-aware, we are a step above. Why? We are not only aware of our surroundings, but we are also aware of ourselves, our strengths, our weaknesses. So, we are very much aware of ourselves. So, that is called self-consciousness, which is a step above the other animals. That is what makes us human, right. So, this is responsiveness is one of the definitive feature of all the animals. And apart from that, cellular organization, right. So, when I say cellular organization, what I mean is there is a beautiful organization that is inside working, inside living beings. So, things are ordered, there is an order for everything, right. Say for example, the way they are all arranged together, you look at any living being, there is an order. We all have eyes at the same place, we have you know, ears at the same place. Never it happens that you know, the disorder happens, right. So, for example, you take beautiful sunflower, it has beautiful yellow color petals. Have you ever looked in the middle of the sunflower? It is beautifully arranged in a geometrical design. So, there is an organization and order in the biological systems, in the living systems, which is definitely not there in the non-living things. And when I say order, inside the cellular organization, in the sense that inside the cell, right, atoms are organized into molecules, molecules are organized into cells, cells are organized into tissues, tissues are organized into organs. So, there is lot of organization that happens within a living organisms. Apart from that, there is an organization which you will see even above the one step above the living organisms when they interact with the environment. For example, you can see the organism always keep interacting with the environment. So, similar organisms are grouped into, you know, if you look at ecological point of view, there is an organization. So, lot of species get organized into a population, I mean species actually is a population. The difference between species and a population is, species is a group of organisms which are similar, which can interbreed freely in nature. That is what we call as a species, right. So, species living in a particular area is known as, at particular time, is called as population. For example, we say population of India, right, or population of Tamil Nadu. So, what we are mentioning here is the human population, we belong to the same species, right, or we say dog population in a certain area in Chennai, which means we are talking about only one species, that is dog. So, the difference between a species and a population is a group of the group of organisms belong to the same species living in a particular area at a particular time. So, then many populations, they organize together, they interact together and form community, and communities interact with the environment and they form ecosystem, and then many ecosystems come under biome, and all the biomes are come under biosphere. So, there is an organization in the biosphere, right, where a lot of these living organisms take part. So, this cellular organization or the organization as such or order as such is one of the most important definitive features of all the living organisms. And apart from that, one more feature of living organisms is that cellular interaction, right, whether is there interaction that happens inside the molecules? Definitely yes, right. Say for example, you take parenchyma tissue. What is its function? Parenchyma tissue is nothing but a collection of cells, is called as tissue. So, only the cell becomes a tissue, it will perform its function. Cell individually will not perform the function of a tissue. The tissue is nothing but a group of cells which are defined to do a particular function. So, it is the interaction between the cells which will bring out that particular function, right. Say for example, you take an example of mitochondria, it is a cell organelle. Mitochondria is made up of so many molecules, right. Whether each molecule can perform the function of mitochondria? Definitely not. So, all the molecules involved in forming mitochondria, they interact together and they actually form mitochondria and do the function of mitochondria, which is nothing but respiration. So, there is a continuous interaction happening within the cell which makes them living. So, without interactions, living organism cannot survive. It is interaction among the living organism, and also as I said, it is the interaction with the environment that continuously it keeps happening. So, interactions are very important part of the living being a living organism, right. So, apart from that, certain one more important definitive feature of all the living organism is nothing but it is actually called as cell regulation. So, regulation is very, very important because you all know, I am sure you would have heard about this word called homeostasis. Homeostasis. So, what is this homeostasis? Homeo means constant, stasis means state. So, always if you look at living organisms, many things inside the living organisms are maintained at a constant state irrespective of what is happening outside. Let us take an example of temperature. No matter where you go, your temperature is always maintained at 37 degrees centigrade, right. Or how much ever sugar you eat, if you are normal, what happens? By the end of your digestion, the sugar level in the blood will come back to certain amount. Your heart, though no matter whether you go and do an exercise, so your heart will beat very fast, but by the time you are resting, it will come back to its original beating rate, which is 72 times per minute, right. You breathe for 12 to 14 times per minute. So, all these things are maintained constantly irrespective of what is happening outside, they will come back to this normal state. So, that is known as self-regulation, it is a form of self-regulation which is called as homeostasis. That is what makes us living, homeostasis. Let me take one example of homeostasis. Say assume that you had gone to a place where it is very, very cold, freezing. So, what happens? You have receptors, right. So, it is very cold outside. So, there is one the receptors in the skin. So, what do? They perceive that coldness, right. And what do? They send the signal to brain. In the brain, there is one particular organ which is known as hypothalamus. I would call it as it is a thermostat of our body. It will always maintain a constant temperature, right. So, it sets the temperature of the body. So, what happens? When the signal comes to hypothalamus, hypothalamus responds to this by sending signals to effectors. When I say effector, in this case the effector should be a muscle. So, when it goes to the muscle, how the muscle will respond? So, muscle will respond by you get that shivering, right. When you go into cold, you feel you feel like shivering, right. So, that is nothing but the muscle contracting. So, the fast contraction of the muscles releases heat. So, once it releases heat, what happens? Temperature comes back to normal, right. So, similarly, say you had gone and to a desert where it is very, very hot, right. So, I will replace this cold with hot. So, what happens? When you actually the receptors send the signal to the same thermostat, which is hypothalamus. Now, hypothalamus sends to signal to another effector, not to the muscle. In this case, it should be to the sweat gland. So, what happens? When you go into a hot weather, you start sweating continuously. So, the moment you start sweating, your body heat goes down and it comes back to normal. So, this is how the homeostasis works beautifully to ensure that conditions are maintained at a steady state irrespective of changes happening outside. So, this is one of the definitive features of living organisms. So, if I summarize what are all the characteristics of the living organisms, whether definitive or not definitive, I am going to include all. So, one includes growth, then reproduction, then it is metabolism, cellular organization, and then response to stimuli or awareness, and then you can call it as self-regulation. Cell interaction or cellular interactions, then you can take it as self-regulation is done. So, apart from that, evolution, you know that all living organisms evolve, right, they continuously evolve. Whether we are evolving, we are also evolving continuously, which is not there in non-living. And then self-replication, right, we keep living organisms can replicate on their own, right. So, these are the features of living organisms, out of which these two are not so definite, not the definitive features. They we need to define the conditions properly when you say these are the characteristics. So, this includes the unifying theme, all the living features, living organisms show these features.